So this segment, we're going to be focusing on board assessments and evaluation, or board assessment or board evaluation. Now, our last session was on board effectiveness, where we basically looked at how well a board helps the organization win safely, sustainably, and ethically. So it's not just about whether meetings happen, but whether the board adds real value through oversight, guidance, and accountability. Now, typically what an effective board does is that it consistently sets and safeguards strategic direction and not day-to-day management. That's for the CEO and his team. The board consistently oversees risk and resilience before crises happen, protects financial integrity, and prevents value leakage, hires, supports, and holds the CEO accountable, ensures ethical culture and compliance, and represents shareholders or stakeholders' interests with independence and courage. So how do we know that a board is effective? And that is what takes us into the realm of board assessment or board evaluation. So in a sense, it moves us, and when we talk about this, our focus is to move from a compliance perspective to something more akin to competitive advantage. In a sense, how do we make a board assessment not just a compliance tick box, but something that can be deployed for the purposes of achieving competitive advantage? In a sense, it works to trigger organizational value, trust, and governance renewal. For this segment, we're going to say, and I would like to put in a statement and say that board effectiveness evaluation is a must for all boards, irrespective of the size of the business, the nature of the business, the type. They should all benefit from board effectiveness evaluation because, in essence, you could benefit from it, but I must also add that the benefit of having a board effectiveness is likely to be proportional to the efforts made in carrying it out. So how useful a board effectiveness evaluation is to an organization is tied to the proportionality of the effort that is put into carrying out the board effectiveness evaluation. Now, what are the benefits for boards, committees, and individuals? These can actually include recognizing mistakes and learning from them, surfacing uncomfortable issues which no one wants to raise. So in a sense, we're trying to identify the elephant in the boardroom and dealing with them. Some of the benefits also include identifying what works and what can be improved, and also considering boardroom dynamics as to whether they are healthy or do they need help. So what we're going to look at is part of it also in terms of the benefits has to do with reviewing the evidence of the outputs of the board and committees and whether good decisions have been made and whether the strategies that we deploy are good ones and whether the values and standards of the board are embedded in the organization. Another benefit is identifying and addressing any gaps in knowledge or experience on the board. And finally, but not the least, the satisfaction of knowing the board, its committees, and members are doing a good job. So to a large extent, it should also not be just a tick box where every single year the assessment reads effective, the board discusses and concludes that they are doing well, and yet all wake up the next season and this business has collapsed. Now, why does a board evaluation matter? As we all know, boards are the apex of organizational accountability. They literally determine the strategic direction, and so everything goes to them. In terms of when you even look at the larger concept of corporate governance and the fact that it has to do with responsibility over risk oversight, accountability, fairness, and transparency. So the boards are the apex body of organizational accountability. And so what also matters is that a strategy may be strong, but it can actually fail under weak governance because it is the governance that is supposed to provide the oversight for the achievements. So where the governance is weak, in a sense, the direction or the job of providing direction for the execution will become a problem. And also, a board evaluation is important because quite a number of governance failures are actually very silent until a crisis hits. And so an evaluation usually will unearth these tickets or these red flags way ahead of time so that steps can be taken to mitigate such challenges. And so to a large extent, board evaluation is the earliest and least expensive correction tool as far as these red flags are concerned. So for today, our session roadmap is going to follow the lines of trying to understand the concept and meaning of board evaluation or board assessment, why we believe that a board evaluation drives organizational success. We are also going to try to understand the types and scope of board evaluation, what a board evaluation cycle entails, what to evaluate when undertaking a board evaluation, the tools and data sources that we deploy, the reporting, action planning, and follow-up. And of course, we cannot leave without looking at the pitfalls that one should avoid, the politics of it, and confidentiality issues. What will be our learning outcomes? At the end of this session, we are hoping that students or participants should be able to first and foremost define board evaluation and distinguish it clearly from management appraisal. Also, we should be able to explain the strategic risk, culture, and reputational value of evaluation. And for that matter, it allows us to be able to make a business case for board evaluations. Also, we're going to try to understand the various types and scope of board, committee, and chair evaluations, and also how to apply a structured evaluation cycle when needed, being able to design at least some basic evaluation instruments, interpret results, and draft actionable improvement plans, and then to be able to manage resistive stance ethically and professionally. So here we want to manage resistance ethically and professionally as well. Now, the bigger question to ask ourselves is, what does a high-performing board look like in action? Now, there's some food for thought that you may want to look at so that at any point in time, when one says that this is a high-performing board, what do you want to see in action? And then, of course, then the flip side of the coin will be what will be the early signs or the early warning signs of a weak board, because then a weak board will fail in its governance function, and then that would be a problem in terms of strategy execution or oversight of strategy execution, risk oversight, accountability, everything would be in jeopardy. And so that's for our warm-up in terms of knowing what a high-performing board looks like. And on the flip side, therefore, what would be the signs or the early warning signs that the board is weak. Now, to put everything in perspective, let's start by at least understanding what a board evaluation is. Typically speaking, when we talk of a board evaluation, we are looking at a structured, evidence-based process where we seek to assess the effectiveness of the board as a collective. So first, the board is one entity. So collectively, how effective is this board? And then, of course, we have learned that boards usually delegate some of their functions through committees. So now, and remember that these committees are supposed to be specialized and also focused. And so we're going to find out to a large extent the performance of the committees. And since the board chair provides leadership, and that's very instrumental to the performance of the board, then the next question we need to look at would be the effectiveness of the board chair. So, and then it also asks the dimension of individual director contribution and overall the governance system that enables the board work. So whenever we are looking at a board evaluation, that's a very comprehensive evidence-based process that tries to look at every aspect of the board to ensure that it delivers, or to ask whether it delivers on its function in terms of governance. Now, what a board evaluation is not, and for that matter, these should be the guiding principles. So whenever we have to do a board evaluation, these are the things that we need to work around so that it warms up the board. One, a board evaluation is not a witch hunt. It is not to look for who is not competent or incompetent or what have you. And neither is it a popularity contest. It's not about who is most popular, because remember, like we said, it is a structured process to look at the board as a collective. So just like a football team, if there's a faulty wing, it will show up in the overall performance of the team in the long run. And so that's that. So it's not a witch hunt, neither is it a popularity contest. And it is also not a management performance appraisal. That's quite different. And it is not, for sure, it is not a ceremonial compliance ritual. And then it's not supposed to be a one-off exercise after a crisis. It should be periodic. And so we're going to look at that. So these are the things that the board evaluation is not, and for which reason it should be something that we work with organizations to accept, and so that then they can encourage a more consistent pattern of board evaluation. Now, what's the logic behind, or the governance logic behind board evaluations? Now, typically speaking, the board evaluates management, and management evaluates staff, and the organization will audit its systems as a whole. Then, of course, the board itself must evaluate itself. So the board must evaluate itself, because there's nothing that can be improved without it being measured. We cannot manage anything. And so the board that is responsible for all of these things, because at the end of the day, if the board is evaluating management, the board itself must evaluate itself to be sure that it has what it takes to provide that oversight and ultimately the evaluation of management. Now, when we are able to do a good job or a well-executed board evaluation, what it does is to produce clear strengths and gaps. And that is part of the performance improvement bit for the board as well, because with those clear strengths and gaps, the board will most likely position itself to leverage on its strengths while minimizing the threats posed by the gaps, and then taking steps to correct them. And of course, that also works to help with better board composition decisions, because by that very essence, where gaps are identified, it means that in restructuring or recruiting new members to the board, these will be taken into consideration so that the collective, which makes up the board, will benefit from the subsequent decisions. What it also does is that when we do a well-executed evaluation, it's able to help improve meeting quality and oversight depth, because it identified elements that are missing typically from best practice positions and others. And it also produces stronger trust with our stakeholders, because then it shows that we are willing to learn, and then we are ready to give of our very best. And then it also provides a measurable governance improvement plan. Now, going further, we can have various levels of assessment. We can have the more broader board level evaluation, and then we can drill down to the various committees. So we have committee evaluations. We can also evaluate the chair. We can have individual director evaluation. And then we can have the board secretariat and information flow review. Now, these are very critical, because together they form the holistic board evaluation or board assessment framework. Now, when we are looking at the effectiveness of a board, and for that matter, its evaluation, we look at the board system view. Now, board effectiveness depends on a number of parameters. So the people, so in terms of the competencies, the independence, and the diversity they bring to the board or to the table. Then we have the processes. So those will be typically the systems, agenda, decision, discipline, etc. Then we're going to look at the information, quality of board papers or board packs. Then the culture within the space, challenge, trust, conduct, psychological safety, among others. And of course, the outcomes, in relation to strategy, risk, and value protection, among others. And so whenever we're looking at the effectiveness of a board, it has to be that we're going to be looking at how these elements are reflected in the assessment framework. So when we want to put the business case for board evaluation in one line, in a sense, to interrogate why a board evaluation is critical, and this is very important. I'm currently engaging a firm for the purposes of a board evaluation, and it's critical because a board evaluation protects value and ultimately creates value. And so, like I said in the earlier slide, it's literally a must for every business, from a family business to a partnership deal that has a board, to a small business that is growing, that has an advisory board. All of these, a board evaluation protects value and ultimately creates value. Now, when we look at the board evaluation, we can then start drilling down to the value that it brings on board. One angle is to look at it in terms of strategic value. When we have a board evaluation from a strategic value perspective, it actually helps boards to challenge strategy constructively, because then they're interrogating whether or not they are in alignment with the strategy and its execution and the proper oversight. And so typically, a board evaluation will help the board to shift from the angle of operational interference to strategic oversight. And then we have the case where it also helps to align board time to long-term priorities as opposed to, yes, the operational interference. But then it also helps improve clarity of direction and decision quality. And so a board evaluation would help to show whether we are more within the space of strategy or we are within the space of operations. And that's very critical, because for the board, the focus should be more in terms of strategy and providing that direction. There's also the risk and assurance value that a board evaluation brings to the board. When we have a good board evaluation, it helps the board to test whether their risk oversight is real or symbolic, because it's going to drill down and probe on questions. It also helps to check the board's understanding of their risk appetite, and it helps to strengthen audit and internal maturity, because it queries all of those. And then it can also help reveal early warning blind spots. So that's with the risk management aspect. So providing risk oversight. So that's for the benefits that board evaluation brings that can be viewed from a risk and assurance or value perspective. There's also an angle that we can look at in terms of the reputation and stakeholder trust. When we do conduct a board evaluation, whenever we do that, we would realize that because it is feedback about how well the board is delivering on its mandates to shareholders and stakeholders, it actually works to build reputation and stakeholder trust, because it signals credibility. So it helps strong boards to signal that they are credible, because they are willing and able to open themselves up to an assessment. What it also does is that it helps regulators and investors to trust the transparency of their governance systems, because that's where they are opening up for all to do the assessment and to see they're willing to learn. What it also helps is to strengthen public confidence, and that also can work in both ways, even in terms of attracting capital, and it helps prevent governance surprises, because then everything is typically being assessed and relatively made open. The culture and people value. And so board culture typically influences organizational culture. So where we do evaluations, it helps to surface issues like groupthink, weak challenge culture, chair dominance or silence, or disengagement. And these are very critical cultural dynamics that that can be picked up with a board evaluation, so that corrective measures can be taken in that regard. So when we put all of that together, a simple causal chain emerges where we realize that a board evaluation can actually lead to improved governance quality, meaning that the board is able to, based on the board evaluation, the board can then become an improved version of itself. Now, by providing that improved governance quality, it leads to better strategy and risk oversight, which is actually the crucial function of the board. And by doing so, it results ultimately in organizational resilience and performance, which, of course, if you want to stretch it to the finance bit, will result in shareholder or stakeholder wealth maximization. So that's the simple causal chain when you begin to trigger from a board evaluation. And so typically one question that somebody may ask, therefore, what if we have a strong management, but we have a weak board? What are some of the risks that will emerge? Now, a strong management team with a weak board can actually look fine in the short term, but in the long term, it creates a very high risk imbalance. And then the risks that tend to emerge sometimes can be looked at from perspective, but I would like to speak to the issue of a strategic risk, for example. When the board is weak, then it means that the very core function of interrogating the strategy can become questioned because strategy goes unchallenged because management may pursue a growth path that is exciting but misaligned with long-term enterprise value. And so those are challenges or risks that could emerge where the management is strong but the board is weak. They are not able to provide the relevant oversight. The same principle means that where management is strong but the board is weak, overconfidence risk may arise where strong executives can become too certain of their models, timelines, and markets without constructive board challenge coming in to shape up on the dynamics. And so those are the things. And in a number of cases as well, you find therefore that the founder or the CEO will dominate. And so the organization can drift into CEO-led governance where oversight becomes more of symbolic instead of being real. And there are other risks that can actually emerge, but these are just one side in terms of strategic elements because we can have continuity and legacy risk. We can have stakeholder confidence risk. We can have people and culture issues, among others. When it comes to board evaluation, there are types from the very simple to the slightly more complex. So for typical small boards that we have or for first timers, what we normally would recommend would be an internal self-assessment. Now, this is something you do typically every single year. You do that because then it allows one to work through a number of issues. At this point, for the internal self-assessment, normally you would find that we would allow each director to complete a confidential questionnaire. So that's when we do an internal self-assessment, we allow each director to do or to complete a confidential questionnaire. And then, of course, like I mentioned, it is low cost and best for first-time evaluations or relatively smaller boards. It's quite low cost, fast, and good, and a good starting baseline. Then we can go on to the peer assessment where directors evaluate collective performance and where it is appropriate one another against clear criteria. What this does is that it's more like a layer 2. It begins to build accountability and reveals dynamics. And it works best where the trust is strong and tools are well designed. We could also have a chair-led review. Here, the board chair leads a structured process using agreed tools and selected interviews. Now, when we have a credible, neutral, and disciplined chair, then a chair-led review can be actually a strong avenue for utilization. And then you can use that also sometimes for what we can say annual health checks. Last but not least, but usually more complex, is the externally facilitated evaluation. Here we have an independent expert, so that's what we do a lot of the times, where we lead the process with tools, interviews, and benchmarking. Now, this particular form of assessment offers the highest credibility for shareholders, regulators, and investors because it comes in with a different flavor. And so in doing such, we do realize that it's best usually for complex boards, group structures, or where transformation is needed. So normally the recommendation is to work with, as for the internal and the others, it can be annual, and the externally facilitated one can work within 2 to 3 years. So here we can actually put them together within the framework of internal versus external. When it's internal, meaning that it's done in-house or by in-house expertise, it is faster, cheaper, and good for mature boards, but then it also suffers from the risk of bias and politeness. In terms of the external one, there's greater objectivity and depth, and it also provides stronger credibility with stakeholders. And so you realize that the skew is towards an external evaluation as and when the need arises, typically within 2 to 3 years. And so, like I said, one such firm that we are working to commission such, it is because they want to see greater objectivity in the assessment as to how well they are doing, the depth of same. And then by so doing, they signal stronger credibility with the stakeholders. I mentioned earlier that for the annual light touch internal review, annual it is once every year, but then the periodic deep dive for the external review, we do 2 to 3 years. And then after certain scenarios such as mergers, crisis, or major strategic shifts, it's important to find out whether the board is effective in delivering. Now, what approach should one use? And these will be influenced by, of course, the sector. If you happen to be a SEC-regulated entity, it's becoming more of a mandatory element. For the others, it may not be. In some cases as well, the maturity of your board will determine. But of course, a newer board and smaller board will start with an internal assessment. And of course, the risk profile of the entity will determine whether it is going to be a simple one or an externally facilitated one. Of course, the history of the governance issues as alongside stakeholder expectations. Now, in terms of the board evaluation cycle or how we go about it, first and foremost, to start any assignment, we must agree on objectives and the scope. What exactly are we seeking to do and how do we want to go about that? Because that will shape, to a large extent, the selection of the framework and even the methodology to choose, and for that matter, the kind of evidence that is considered relevant, and then even the tools that will be used to analyze and prioritize. And then in reporting the findings, these will be worked alongside the agreed objectives and scope. And of course, in implementing and tracking improvement in terms of the recommendations, these would also be shaped by the original objectives, because the ability or otherwise of the board to have delivered on those objectives through the evaluation will determine what needs to be added or what needs to be structured. Now, in terms of the objectives and scopes, I'm just going to walk through some of the basics that we do when we are, in terms of the objectives and the scope, the questions we may want to be asking is, what exactly do we want to improve now? What must be protected? And what is the board's next strategic horizon? And of course, the scope options here, we're going to look at whether we should be looking at the board, only the board with committees, or the board with chair plus individuals. Now, these are subject to the parameters that we are seeking. So your objectives that we set, or the objectives we set, will shape how we proceed in terms of the scoping. Now, common evaluation domains. Yes, well, now that we know what we are looking for with scope, now the framework, what framework will deliver? Would it be a composition and skills assessment mostly? Would it be a case of the governance architecture itself? Will it give us the information we're looking for? What about the board processes, the strategy, oversight, risk and internal control, culture and ethics, committee effectiveness, stakeholder and ESG oversight? Now, to a large extent, that would be influenced more by the scope of the piece of work that needs to be done. Then, of course, methodology, and that's how to execute. So mostly you can find structured questionnaires, one-on-one interviews, document reviews, board committee observation where feasible, strategy, and KPI reviews. And then the final one will be risk and audit artifacts review. And so these are the methodological options we deploy. Key is a structured questionnaire which goes into all the aspects of what makes a board effective so that we can have intel to be able to write a very meaningful report. These can be followed by one-on-one interviews to flesh out details that were not so clear in terms of the structured questionnaires. And then it goes on and we review other documents. Now, what kind of evidence would we normally be collecting? Of course, the board charter and the committee charters or the terms of reference, the meeting minutes where they are available, the board packs and board pre-reads. So all of these are very critical to show whether in terms of whether agenda, everything, the information for decision-making, everything is on point. Then it's important to also read risk reports and audit findings. These are critical, as well as attendance and participation records of all relevant board meetings. After the collection of the data, of course, the analytics will emerge. And so that's where the scoring framework of the Likert plus indices can come in. And then you can also pull out qualitative themes from interviews and then the heat maps for priority areas and then root cause analysis. So in doing the analytics, the heat maps for priority areas and then root cause analysis. After the analysis, one has to do the reporting, the write-up actually that begins to document what is on the ground. A strong report should include purpose and scope, the methodology that was used, the board strengths, priority gap, root causes, recommendations, and then governance action road map. And then, of course, there's a need to follow up, finishing all of that and allowing it to stay. So then there's a need to assign ownership. So through chairs, committee leads, company secretary, who is responsible? So literally it's a case of what needs to be done, who needs to do it, and when do they need to do that? So you realize that we can define our quick wins as to when. And so we have shorter ones and we have longer term ones, 6 to 12 months. And of course, we would use that to build evaluation into the board calendar so that it becomes a very constant and periodic thing. Now, what do you evaluate when you want to do a deep dive? So now if we get deeper into the composition, for example, if you want to look at composition and capability, then you want to find out whether the skills matrix actually fits the strategy. You want to look at the issue of diversity of experience and thought. You also want to look at independence, balance, tenure, renewal, and succession, and onboarding and continuous learning. These are very critical areas for the composition and capability. Then, of course, the next question is to look at whether or not the governance architecture is delivering. So first, we need to go and evaluate board charter clarity. So how clear is the board charter? And then there are committee structure adequacy. Do we have sufficient people on the committee, and is it that one or two people are dominating, etc.? Then we can look at delegation of authority. Are there clear lines as to who gets to determine what? And of course, the last but not least, role boundaries between board and management. These are very critical. It needs to be made very clear. Then we're going to look at, in our reporting, board process quality, agenda discipline, meeting effectiveness, time allocation between strategy versus operation, quality of debates and decisions, and then action tracking. So that's where the reporting bit comes in. Then, of course, information quality. There's a need to test whether board papers are timely, structured, decision ready, and risk aware, aligned to KPIs and strategies. So you find that in some cases, you could take actually a board's minutes and they are as empty as they come, and the issues were discussed. And so we've come across cases such as those, and you have no idea what issues were discussed. Were they friendly issues? What issues were discussed? And so it's important that board papers, where you're looking at quality, the board papers must be timely, structured, decision ready, and risk aware. So decision ready, all the relevant or the nuanced parts would be captured. Then we have chair effectiveness. How effective is the chair? So in terms of agenda leadership, inclusivity, and balance of voice, then ability to manage conflict, not to avoid it, encouraging a challenge culture for different opinions to be heard. And of course, that could boil down to the nature of the chair. And of course, what is the relationship with the CEO without capture? So these are critical elements when you want to look at how effective the board chair is. Now we move on to committee effectiveness. That is because these committees are subunits that work together with the board to achieve the excellence. And so even as the main board has been evaluated and it's important that the committees be also evaluated to look at mandate clarity, technical expertise or competence on the board, frequency and depth of review, reporting quality to the board, or alignment to strategic risk. These are critical elements as far as committee effectiveness is concerned. And then that strategy and oversight, measuring whether the board shapes and tests strategy. So how often do they speak to strategy and what else do they do? Track strategic KPIs, test assumptions and scenarios, and monitors execution risk. And so that's for the strategy oversight. And then we look at, for the board, risk and internal control oversight, the key element is to look at the risk appetite, the top enterprise risk, the internal and internal audit performance, crisis preparedness, and compliance maturity. So that's for the next domain on risk and internal control oversight. And then we look at the culture. How free are people to speak, conduct, openness, all of these. And of course, the issue of whistleblowing, ethical decision-making patterns, tone at the top, stakeholder ownership, ESG oversight, and oversight relevance to strategy. What are the core tools that we could use when we want? And so these are practical things that you're being taught. When you have to do the board evaluation, these are the tools we use. So these are some of the minimum tools. At least your board evaluation questionnaire, and it comes from a good understanding of what should be visible as far as an effective board is concerned, so that on a Likert scale, they begin to choose strongly agreed or which one aligns better. Interview guide, and this would typically be fleshed out after picking the intel from the evaluation questionnaire, so that the missing parts from the evaluation questionnaire will influence the interview guide. And then, of course, the board skills matrix. Each board has a different set of skills that they need to be able to deliver excellently. And so it's important to find out whether all the board members are having the right mix so that to collectively or holistically, they can do the job in terms of being an effective board. And of course, sometimes an observation guide, and then a scoring heat map. And last but not least, a governance improvement action template. When all is said and done, there must be improvement. What skills typically would be needed on the board? Typically, we can go to look at industry expertise, finance and audit, risk management, legal, regulatory, digital technology, ESG, and stakeholder, human capital. But of course, these can vary from entity to entity in terms of the weighting. So the key issue is to compare what existed or is existing versus what is needed, and the gap would actually drive the recruitment in terms of the skills gap. And then when you're reporting in terms of the board evaluation, it's important to turn, and that's what we do, we turn our findings into priorities. And the reason is that you would get to know which ones are weighty and not, and so you make those ones priorities that must be addressed. So you prioritize, so that's what we do. We prioritize using the impact it will have on strategy and risk by creating which ones are weightier. So the impact, the agency for in terms of regulatory and market expectations, and then feasibility of reforms, reputation, exposure. So all of these things weight or determine how we prioritize so that those that are important or weightier would come to the fore, and then we followed in that order. What we do is that we make sure that each recommendation would include a clear objective, a responsible owner, the timelines for the execution or the delivery of that recommendation, the resources that will be needed, and what it means when it has been successfully achieved. And so whenever we do a board evaluation or writing a board evaluation report and making recommendations, these are the elements that we make sure we do capture. And of course, once that is done, you cannot just walk away without providing a board improvement plan. And so you can have the quick wins that can be delivered or must be delivered or worked on within 0 to 90 days. And then within the next 3 to 6 months that we would like to call a Horizon 2, we are going to look at how processes and committee upgrades can be done to fit based on the reports that you mentioned. Of course, the 6 to 12 months, that's Horizon 3, would trigger a board renewal, relevant culture shifts, if any, and then capability investments. And so these are the things that we put down typically for any entity that calls. And it doesn't have to be a large entity. The key issue is about performance improvement. But of course, there are pitfalls. Sometimes a lot of organizations we've come across may want to avoid it. And it's because for some of them, they do treat evaluation more as a compliance ritual. So it's not something they're even excited to do, but from a consultant's perspective, I would normally recommend that this is not a compliance ritual. It is a genuine probe to improve upon what exists. And then of course it's important we try not to rely on questionnaires. It's important to also engage and probe some of the finer details using interviews among others. And then some would also avoid assessing the chair or individuals because we want to play nice. And these are challenges that we face every now and then. And in some cases, we try to also even ignore the culture and dynamics. That means that, and once we begin to take some of these elements or drop some of them, it means that in reality, the board evaluation will not necessarily be telling us the truth. And another pitfall is producing a report but with no action plan, because then what is the essence? Or no follow-up in terms of tracking to see that things have been delivered. Now, of course, there would always be resistance. And some of the objections are we're already a strong board, so it's not necessary. And we have all been in this country to see firms that have collected awards only to collapse in a massive and a spectacular manner the following season. And so you find when we engage and we find, oh, we're already good, all everything is fine, when in reality it's not. And of course, it's still the case that majority see it as an unnecessary cost and the possibility that it will create conflicts because weaknesses of certain members may emerge. And so, of course, there's always the tendency where they would ask, so you write in sometimes a proposal or someone wants it done, maybe the board secretary seeks to want to have it done as part of their job in seeing to it that the governance mandates are being respected, and yet there will be constant postponement. So, of course, when that happens, we do respond by letting them know that evaluation protects reputation and strategic resilience. And of course, we also respond to the effect that this is a governance investment and not a cost. So you are investing in your governance, and we know the value of governance right from the get-go in terms of even what it does, attracting talent, a pool, getting investors, stakeholders, etc., trust and all. And then, of course, last but not least, strong boards evaluate early, not after the crisis. I mean, the strong boards are more proactive. And so these are some of the rebuttals we do give when we find challenges or objections within the space where we would want to undertake a board evaluation. So those are some of the things. And of course, it's important to maintain confidentiality and professional conduct in these. So of course, identities are typically protected when we write our reports. We use the evidence, not opinions. And then there's always avoidance of blame language, where we try to focus more on the governance improvement by maintaining neutrality and respect. But the quiet truth, boards rarely fail loudly. They fail through complacency, weak challenge, poor information, unclear strategic oversight, and then passive risk governance. And so it goes without saying that the board evaluation is not necessarily a verdict. It's a mirror that shows what the board is doing well, what it must improve, and what could become tomorrow's crisis if things are ignored. And that is what leads us into our final takeaways, where I like to say that a board evaluation is essential to renewal, credibility, strategic relevance, risk intelligence, and stakeholder trust. And so when we work with boards, we realize that it is the most respected boards that have made it a habit of institutionalizing evaluation. Weaker boards shy away from that. And so that's one thing we've come to notice, that most respected boards attempt or do their very best to institutionalize. So it's a running system. It is not a one-off item. And so I'll close by saying that if a board wants to remain credible, and that's what I've come to see in my line of work, it should always be asking the question, what would an independent structured review reveal about how we govern today? Which governance gaps could quietly undermine our strategy? This is a question I invite boards to always consider. It can start simple, where they adopt an annual internal assessment and then they schedule a deeper independent review periodically, and then, of course, committing to a tracked governance improvement plan. So that's typically for what we have. This will be our take home, where if you had to do the job of designing or drafting a one-page board evaluation terms of reference outline to include objectives, scope, methodology, deliverables, timeline, confidentiality terms, roles, and responsibilities. Kindly take this as the take-home assignment. Do that, and then I'll kindly upload to the assignment link for risk management next week, and then we'll take it to the next level. So thank you very much for your time, and we'll meet again for the next session.